Welcome back. Panelists here. NBC News Chief Washington Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, the Washington Post Foreign Affairs columnist David Ignatius, Shane Harris, National Security Reporter for the Washington Post, and PBS NewsHour Chief Correspondent Amna Nawaz. All right, China and the role they may or may not play here, Andrea. I want to put up the two readouts because the good news was the readouts indicated they were at least on the same phone call. Sometimes you get readouts and they're not. I'm going to put up quickly what the Chinese side said. All sides need to jointly support Russia and Ukraine in having dialogue and negotiation that will produce results and lead to peace. U.S. and NATO should also have dialogue with Russia to address the crux of the Ukraine crisis and ease the security concerns of both Russia and Ukraine. And, of course, the White House emphasized that they warned China, don't help the Russians. He described the implications and consequences if China provides material support to Russia as it conducts brutal attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilians. We love to say, watch what they do, not what they say, whether it's Russia or China. But what they said indicated something, Andrea.
What they said, though, indicated they had to talk about Taiwan because everyone is analogizing Ukraine and Taiwan. They had to separate that out. And also because President Biden, frankly, last October in a town hall was a little bit off the one-time China policy. He was less ambiguous than previous presidents have been, going all the way back to 1979. They had to lay that as a marker. That said, there was other language in there. And talking to officials on both sides, frankly, there's, first of all, saying that the U.S. and China have a stake as Security Council members in working something out, not just NATO and the U.S. with Russia, but also nobody really thinks that despite Russia's request, which the U.S. leaked, again, leaking intelligence, no one really thinks that China was going to provide weapons. But this was sort of a don't do it. It's drones, it's UAEs, it's the money. It's getting around the sanctions.
Because they've done that for North Korea in the past.
Right, exactly. It's the material support. When they said material support, they don't want that. And the fact is that Secretary Blinken actually met with the Chinese ambassador.
After the call.
After the call.
In person.
In person. Yep. He was going over to the State Department to see the Deputy Secretary, Wendy Sherman, and they had a meeting which has not been reported. And there is follow-up here. China wants to be seen as a neutral broker. And they don't want to be seen as embracing the civilian horrors that we are seeing.
So, David,
they're not at all happy about it.
You think Putin received the message that China's not going to be his lifeline?
So I think Putin should be worried that China, his only meaningful ally, is distancing itself. And that's the way I read this call. China wants to distance itself enough from Putin that it isn't taken down with this invasion of Ukraine. And in a sense, the biggest obstacle to Xi's China dream, as he calls it, this idea of China emerging as a dominant player, right now is the alliance with Russia, which is a pariah. Which poisons Xi's future. So I think the call was part of a number of things we've seen. There was a very explicit op-ed written by the Chinese ambassador in the Washington Post.
Well, that was the most significant.
Saying, we're not on board. We believe in territorial integrity and sovereignty. So if I were Putin, I'd be worried about my erstwhile Chinese ally.
So let's talk about NATO this week, Amna. What should we expect from this meeting?
So that's obviously ongoing negotiation right now, exactly what they're going to do. The G7 countries are going to be the nation where they talk about additional, economic sanctions and steps they can take.
What's left for the military on the sanctions front?
Broader, more significant restrictions on Russian banks, complete removal from the SWIFT financial system. I mean, the knock-on effects of all of this are something they are all deeply weighing, as no one's been hit harder by some of these sanctions, certainly Russia and the Russian people, but also the European nations. And so there's a lot of consideration about what exactly to do there. They are very clear about military intervention in this at this point. Any European official you talk to, any American official.
The NATO security. You heard the two American representatives, they're ready to go to war. I'm not saying they don't want to, but
absolutely.
But boy, the NATO Secretary General seemed to really, the chemical weapons was not going to be a red line.
No, he said there would be a violation of international law, and so the question there is, and then what? And we've seen that before. I mean, we saw that in Syria. And let's be clear, too, the line from what we saw in Syria and Russian aggression there and the brutal aerial bombardment of Aleppo, there's a direct line from that to what we are seeing now. So the military line, if there's a red line at all, it is just an Article 5 violation, and that is a direct attack on NATO or NATO interests.
Let's talk about Shane and everybody here. This decision by the president to call him a war criminal. It was very intentional by Biden. Sometimes Biden says things, as she pointed out, but take a look at this clip. This was intentional.
Mr. President, after everything we've seen, are you ready to call Putin a war criminal? is a war criminal.
No, that was absolutely intentional. That's not off the cuff. And when the president says it, now it's policy, even though previously officials in his administration have been reluctant to do that. Practically speaking, I'm not sure it really matters all that much. We're not a party to the International Criminal Court.
Except you have to negotiate with a war criminal?
Well, exactly. Now, are we doing that? This is where it creates a moral ambiguity, I think, here that is very dangerous for the president. On the one hand, you're negotiating with a war criminal. On the other hand, you're calling him a war criminal, but we're not going to get involved when he's shelling civilians. How does he square that? And I think there's a real risk that for the summit next week, it ends up making officials look more feckless. Because what are they going to do? They're not going to draw new red lines. You press Stoltenberg 5 different ways on this. He won't even say chemical weapons is a red line. But yet, Putin is a war criminal. There's dissonance there.
What's interesting is that at the State Department, day after day, I was questioning Ned Price, the spokesman, about, isn't he a war criminal? Look at what's happening. And he kept saying, we are investigating reports of war crimes. We can't
Or
call
they'd
them
say,
war crimes.
we believe he's committed war crimes, but they haven't called him a war criminal.
Exactly. And then until the UN ambassador said it, and then they explained, well, she said it because she was speaking from the heart. But then when the president said it, then it became policy, as Shane says, and it became policy, and you're going to end up negotiating with Vladimir Putin no matter what happens.
David?
So, I mean, at the end of the day, this will require an off-ramp. It will require a negotiation. And for Putin especially, a person who takes things so personally, who just feels humiliated, slighted, obviously has this huge chip on his shoulder, to make an ad hoc attack, I think was really unwise. And I don't think it was pre-planned. I mean, there was a big crowd.
Not
Somebody
pre-planned,
shouts
I do think people have been trying to get him to up his rhetoric in general, and he grabbed that.
Chuck, that was Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden, he's just, average Joe. He is a war criminal, and you ask him, so he says, yeah, he is.
But after seeing Mariupol, and after seeing that video that day, they felt, and he felt, that he could no longer, it sounded too legalistic and too cute by half. To just
somehow try
And it is a legal definition, right? And that's something the prosecutors have to figure out. Putin has to be held responsible. Forced displacement is also a war crime. And the UN has new numbers this morning, 6.5 million Ukrainians internally displaced on top of the 3.5 million refugees. You're talking about 10 million people affected.
And I think we're up to 1.5 million children.
Just don't close doors to the settlement that's necessary to keep
Absolutely right.
that country from being destroyed and to prevent escalation into something that's a nightmare.
All right.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.